Hi, my name is Adam Juratovac, and I'm an employment lawyer right here in San Jose, California at Juratovac Law. Welcome to my channel, and thank you for joining us. So if you're new here, as I said earlier, I'm a California employment lawyer, so we talk a lot about California employment law. In this video, we're going to be discussing overtime in the state of California. Overtime wages, overtime pay, as well as how to calculate overtime, because the way we calculate in California is a little different than the way they calculate it federally or in other states. So first things first, in the state of California, every single employee is an hourly worker and is entitled to an hourly wage unless the employer, your boss, the manager, the company, unless the employer can prove that they are entitled to an overtime exemption. Now, how you explain that in normal people's words is, hey, if you're working at a job, you should be paid by the hour, meaning that if you work more than 8 hours in a day, you should be paid overtime. But a lot of people here are paid salaries, so they're not getting paid on an hourly basis. However, one of the things that employers do is they misclassify their hourly workers and say they're entitled to a salary. That way they could work those employees 80, 90 hours a week without having to pay one dime of overtime. So what the salary basis test tells us is that your salary, the salary of an employee who the employer wants an overtime exemption for, needs to be more than 2 times California's minimum wage. 2 times. So for the employer to pass the salary basis test, that employer needs to pay that employee, the one that they want to qualify for an overtime exemption, they need to pay that employee $64,480 minimum. So since the minimum wage has been growing each and every single year, the minimum salary for that salary basis test has also been inching and growing year over year. So if you're earning under $64,000 in 2023 as a salaried employee, you should start tracking the hours that you work, because it doesn't even matter what job duties you have. The employer can't even get to the analysis of whether they qualify for an exemption because they didn't pass the first test, meaning they didn't even pay you enough. So that's something to look out for. So assuming that the employer passes a salary basis test, meaning that they're paying their employee more than $64,480 per year on a salary basis that cannot change week after week. So say the employer passes that test. There are a bunch of ways where an employer can still qualify for an overtime exemption and not have to pay an individual overtime for all the hours that they work. There's an executive exemption, administrative exemption, professional exemption, and one thing I like to say is, look at any type of profession that has a lobbyist group. So think about real estate agents, brokers, attorneys, doctors, certain engineers. There are more ways for those professions or the employers in those professions to qualify for an overtime exemption for one of their employees, just because those lobbyist groups influence the law. They influence the exemptions. For example, if you're a doctor or a lawyer and you're doing those types of duties at work, good luck. Because if your employer is paying you at least $64,480 and you're doing those types of jobs, your employer is going to qualify for an overtime exemption. But this video isn't about doctors or lawyers or civil engineers or anything like that. This video is about the hourly worker, because in the state of California, we have overtime laws. And our overtime laws are a little bit different than the federal overtime laws. For example, federally, what we hear all the time is you're entitled to overtime for every hour you worked more than 40 in 1 week. So let's look at that. If you work 8 hours on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, that's 40 hours. Meaning if you work on Saturday, all of those hours would be overtime in federal law. But in the state of California, we actually have a greater protection here. So just like federal, you are entitled to overtime wages if you work more than 40 hours in a week, or if you work more than 8 hours in a day. So let me give you a couple examples. Example number 1, say you work 8 hours on Monday through Friday, so you're working 40 hours total over those 5 days. On Saturday, if you work another 8 hours, that 8 hours should be counted as overtime wages, meaning that you should be getting paid your overtime rate for every hour that you worked. Now, in that situation or example, you have an individual working 40 hours a week and only 8 hours in a day max. Now let's switch it up a little bit. Now in this example number 2, imagine you have an employee who's working 20 hours a week. Is that individual entitled to overtime wages? We don't know yet. There's not enough facts. It depends on how many days that individual works and how many hours that individual works per day. So for example, they work 20 hours in a week. Say they worked 12 hours on Monday and 8 hours on Tuesday. Now, the question is, how many hours of overtime wages should that individual earn, or did that individual earn? If you said 4, you're absolutely correct. Even though that individual only worked 20 hours in the entire week, if you break down their days and look at that Monday, that individual still worked 12 hours. And in the state of California, if you work over 40 hours in a week, or if you work over 8 hours in a day, that's when you start counting your overtime wages. So that day that individual worked 12 hours, she or he should have been paid 8 hours of regular time and then 4 hours of overtime. Now, when you're calculating your overtime wages, you take your normal rate of pay, so your normal hourly rate, and then you multiply it by 1.5 or time and a half. So for example, if you're getting $20 an hour for your work and then you work an overtime hour, you're entitled to get paid $30 for every single overtime hour you worked. Now, in certain situations, people actually get double overtime. So when you're working double overtime, instead of multiplying your hourly rate by 1.5, you're multiplying your hourly rate by 2. So in that same example where you have an individual earning $20 an hour, if they're working double overtime or the hours that they're working qualify as double overtime, they should be getting paid $40 an hour. Now, one thing to look out for, though, is some employers fraudulently change people's timesheets. So for example, if you work 12 hours in a day, they'll say, hey, only write 8 hours on your timesheet for today, and you don't have to come to work tomorrow for 4 hours, just write those 4 hours in tomorrow. That's unlawful. You can't do that in the state of California. If your employer ever changes your timesheets, the first thing you should do is start documenting the changes that they're making, and then you should start tracking your own hours that you worked with your own timesheets that you keep at home. Because a lot of the times, these employers are changing, when they do change the timesheets, I'm not saying a lot of employers do, but the ones who do, when they do change those timesheets, a lot of times they typically change them with similar patterns. They will make certain patterns and just apply those over the course of weeks, months, or years. So if you keep your own records, you're able to contradict the patterns that the employer has been fraudulently creating. And that way, you can show that you're actually entitled to some more wages.